Thank you, Megan. It's, uh, just to remind everyone that if you do have questions, you can ask them in the chat room. We'll be on the lookout. Several of us will be on the lookout for questions coming in there, not to preclude any questions directly at the end of the presentation, assuming we've got time. But it's my pleasure to introduce to you guys today Chris Reagan. Chris is a member of Haynes and Boone's Energy, Power, and Natural Resources Practice Group. And he's got a very broad energy practice, including assisting clients in the acquisition, development, and disposition of energy assets and mining properties. Chris is located, his office is in out of Denver. And so he does have some of that mining expertise to go along with advising clients in joint ventures and developing oil and gas properties, addressing negotiation and drafting of farm out agreements, purchase and sale agreements, joint development agreements, and crude oil purchase agreements. And so his experience involves both upstream and midstream companies. Interesting aspect of Chris's experience, and one that we found very useful, is that he's chair of our Indian Law Practice Group, but prior to joining the firm, Chris represented some of the largest energy producing Indian tribes in a broad range of issues related to the development of tribal natural resources. And we call on him quite often to address those issues with tribal lands. And Chris has authored several different articles, and what is most important about today's presentation is Chris is part of our energy ESG committee, and he and several others are working directly with ESG matters and the development and evolution of those topics as we move forward. With that, Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike. So let me try to share my screen. Okay. So hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Mike, and thanks for putting this on. I'm going to talk to you about ESG and what you need to know on ESG. And I think this is something that many of us kind of just saw coming out of nowhere in 2019, 2020. This became all of the hype, 2020 in particular, and into 2021. And a lot of that had to do with the change in the administration to the Biden administration, which made it very clear that they were going to focus on climate change. And the SEC and the federal government was going to spend some time focusing on ESG disclosures. But ESG investing and ESG in particular is not new. It's been around for 20 or more years, although only recently has gained mainstream attraction. When I first started to seriously look into ESG, I was surprised. I do a lot of work for oil and gas companies, many of them, onshore independents that I did not think were focused on ESG. And I knew that some of the majors were aware of it, were working on it. We saw in 2019, Shell, Exxon making those 2050 net zero commitments. But I was very interested to see a lot of these independents had been releasing corporate sustainability reports for more than a decade. And, in a industry that their sole goal is to produce hydrocarbons, I was just surprised to see that. So I guess the question is, what changed to cause the interest in ESG recently? And I think that's something that obviously dealt with the change in administration, but I think a lot of it had to do with just investors being able to earn returns on their investments in renewables or other ESG related industries. I think the pandemic also played a part. So more people were spending at home. Companies were beginning to focus more on their employees, how they're treated, their happiness, things of that nature, employee safety. There's obviously growing concern both at the federal level and just in popular culture about climate change and its impact. I know, at least in Colorado last year, there were in California as well. But when I looked outside, I saw the sky was red and covered in smoke for probably a good week, and could not go outside and run. And never before had we seen this, that a lot of our state was in fact on fire. The political change obviously made a huge impact here. We've got an SEC that is highly focused on ESG disclosures. I think Janet Yellen just released a report, and Gary Gensler just made a statement regarding ESG. We know that the federal rule, the SEC is going to come out with some federal rules in it's supposed to be this fall. I was fully expecting them by now, but the disclosure rules are not released, but they are forthcoming. And so ESG is definitely going to become more and more important going forward. And it's important to be aware of what's going on before these rules kind of come down the pike. All right, let's see if I can do this. Okay, a little bit about Haynes and Boone. So we're a international law firm, 600 or more lawyers. We have 18 offices and a full service law firm that has a variety of practice areas. And those practice areas, range from what I do, which is oil and gas, the same with Mike, do litigation, corporate work, securities, environmental, health and benefits, health and food and safety, et cetera. So I'm in Denver. We have a smaller office here in Denver. It says right here, 17 lawyers in our Denver office. Most of our offices and most of our lawyers and employees are in Texas. We've got Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, the Woodlands, et cetera. But we also have offices in London and Shanghai. We have a growing presence in California and New York, in DC and Charlotte as well. And so it's really, for me being in Denver, I work almost exclusively with other lawyers, either in Dallas or in Houston. There's a lot of cross-office collaboration, and it's always fun to be working on some sort of international project with somebody from Shanghai or London or Mexico City. And I know Mike was working recently on a Mexico City issue. And so there's a lot of just kind of cross collaboration. We have a great culture here. I think that's truly what I enjoy most about Haynes and Boone. It promotes a collaborative environment, and it's really been beneficial for my practice and helping me work with security lawyers, litigators, et cetera, to learn more about ESG and the risks that it can present. So what is ESG? ESG, environmental, social, and governance criteria, comprise a set of standards for a company's operations that socially conscious investors use to screen potential investments. When I originally started learning about ESG in earnest, I was focused on the environmental aspect. And obviously, for most of my clients, oil and gas producers, they were very concerned about this as well. So what comprises the E in ESG? And so environmental, that kind of deals with your carbon footprint. So how is a company dealing with efficiency, whether it's, efficiency in your building, in your operations, in your activities, or if you're an oil and gas producer out in the field, so is there going to be improvements in greenhouse gas reductions over the years, things of that nature. There's environmental safety records, renewable energy, and impacts of operations on the environment. And that can be, at a meta level or a micro level. And the focus, the nice thing about ESG is it's not one thing for any entity. So if you are a health food company, ESG is entirely different to you as a health food company than it is to a mining company, for example, with a massive environmental footprint. So, when people think about ESG, they, at least in my conversations, it's always focused on the environmental aspect of it. And when I speak to clients and they say, hey, we are an oil and gas producer, how can we improve our ESG when all we're doing is producing hydrocarbons? And, clearly this is a primary focus. And what I remind them is, that's only one leg of a three-legged stool as far as ESG. So you also have the social component. So what is social? And that's health and safety, community relations, supply chain considerations, things of that nature. So if you are, for example, operating in Alabama, in the past, if you're an extractive industry, there was CSR issues, but now we're saying, what are you doing with that community? Are you investing in that community? Are you hiring local workers, things of that nature? If you are, then you can highlight those things. And that is something that you can be proud about with your ESG. 2021 in particular, 2020, I'd say also into 2021, I saw a significant shift from the environmental aspect of ESG into the social. And I think a lot of that had to do with the social justice movements in 2020, where they were focusing both on social justice as well as individual health. And I think a lot of that had to do with how people were faring during the pandemic. There's also workforce issues as far as work from home and mental health and things of that nature. So the social aspects is incredibly broad. And then finally, there's also the governance, and this has to deal with board independence, diversity and inclusion, shareholders' rights, executive compensation. We've seen in 2020 in particular, a lot of companies are starting to move toward executive pay tied to ESG metrics, which has been a significant shift. And there's also been a lot of change in the boardrooms regarding ESG. So whereas years ago, you might have some sort of committee that will also look at ESG, and now companies are forming ESG committees specifically focused on dealing with ESG. And they want to make sure that their directors are all aware of what's going on with ESG. So, in years past, it might be one or two people who were even aware of what ESG is. And now they have entire committees that are formed to deal specifically with ESG as companies realize that this is going to be very important moving forward, whether you like it or not. So who's focused on ESG? I think, what was originally intended to be investor focused, trying to figure out where investors should park their money as far as companies, what they're doing on the environmental front, it has kind of transformed. And so ESG is now very broad. It's become mainstream. Everybody's pretty aware of what ESG is. So it's not really a niche investor term anymore. Employees are concerned about ESG. They want to make sure that their employer is doing what they can to deal with various ESG issues, whether it is dealing with the environment or diversity or how the company is governed. There's also issues about suppliers. And we've seen this from, if you are a large company and you're focusing on your own ESG, well, what we're starting to see now is a shift towards focusing downstream of that company and saying, hey, if we're going to be hiring these contractors, these third-party contractors, or we're getting supplies from various companies, we want to make sure that our suppliers and our contractors have great ESG metrics and are at least concerned about that. And we're going to make decisions based on that. There are customers that are focused on ESG, as well as NGOs. And what's interesting is so are lenders. And, I was looking when I was originally starting to look into this with the oil and gas companies in 2020, trying to figure out why oil and gas companies in particular, and apologies for always talking about oil and gas companies, but that's what I do, why they were making all these changes to deal with ESG, and they were so hyper focused about it. And I think what they saw is a lot of, attention from the lender aspect. So whether it's Bank of America, Wells Fargo, or private lenders, which are making ESG they're integrating it into their calculation. And so there's been a lot of, carrot and stick with ESG, where it looks great to investors, but there's also, if you are trying to raise capital, you want to make sure that you are taking certain steps to deal with ESG, because lenders, capital providers are going to want to see that. Same is true with insurers in the communities in which you're working. Okay. So given the spotlight on ESG, what risks do companies face today if they are behind on ESG? And this is something where it's never too late to start. And I say that because the SEC has made it clear that if you're a public company, there are going to be certain disclosure rules that are going to be forthcoming. And they started signaling this in 2020 and in the beginning of 2021. So many companies said, what we'd like to do is we'd like to get ahead of the curve. And instead of being forced to all of a sudden, now you've got these disclosure requirements, these minimum disclosure requirements, we would like to get ahead of the curve because there is significant lead time. If you are disclosing, for example, your carbon footprint, it is going to be incredibly difficult for you to do that on short notice. And so if you are behind on ESG, it might be a good idea to kind of embrace it and say, we would like to be a first mover here, or at least move before the federal government or state governments or other entities, whether it's lenders or investors, force us to make those moves. So what are some risks? Well, there's the cost and availability of capital, and that's something I discussed and we'll talk about later. There's the possibility of shareholder activism. And we saw that with ExxonMobil and a few other entities in 2020 in particular, where small groups, and I forgot the Exxon entity, it's like engine number one. I think they had a 4% interest or smaller in Exxon, and they were able to change the company. And they ended up, I think, placing 2 or 3 directors that were ESG focused on the board of directors for Exxon. And so shareholder activism is something that you want to perhaps get out ahead of. I'd rather be making decisions than being forced to make these decisions as a result of minority interest in your company that is forcing you to make changes. There's also risks associated with electing the board. So a number of entities, proxy service entities and State Street and other groups have said they're going to vote against directors of companies who are behind their peers on ESG. And so they will make recommendations, these proxy services will make recommendations that you vote against directors that do not have ESG experience. There's also the possibility of litigation, and this might come in the form of, I'm not a litigator, I'm not exactly sure how, what sort of hook they would have as far as litigation, but we have seen litigation trying to force disclosures. And so even just fighting against that is going to be difficult. There's also the possibility of you making disclosures, and this is something I'll talk about, making disclosures and them being incorrect, and that also resulting in litigation. And then finally, there's the possibility of regulatory enforcement. And I think this is going to be something that's coming down the pike at the end of this year and also into 2022. Therefore, there's going to be certain disclosure requirements that we're going to see. What are the benefits of developing an ESG strategy? Many people think it's about doing good deeds, and it's not just that. So incorporating ESG into long-term business strategy can help a company develop business opportunities, increase sales, productivity, increase employee happiness while reducing energy demands and expenses. The process also helps companies identify and manage business risks related to ESG. So there might be reputational risk. And we've seen a lot of discussion in 2020 about greenwashing, and same in 2021, where this is part of the reason why the SEC and other federal regulators are coming out with these rules on disclosures, is there's a lot of companies that are saying, look at us, look at all we're doing to be green. And then you remember that the company is a carbon producer. It's an oil and gas company. And you say, wait a second, are you really as green as you are saying? So there's reputational risk in the sense of a company who is behind the 8 ball on ESG disclosures, and the rest of the industry is making these disclosures. You want to make sure that you're not falling behind the pack, you're staying with it. There's the possibility of physical risk. So there's risk to your infrastructure and things of that nature, and you want to get out and get ahead of those things. Regulatory risk, the possibility of being caught flat-footed when new regulations come in. I think everyone's aware that there's going to be a variety of regulations coming forward. And finally, there is the transition risk, which is something that we're seeing more now. For public companies, what can go wrong by disclosing ESG goals and achievements? Obviously, companies, if they have an ESG policy, they're proud of it, they want to disclose it, it looks good to investors, it looks good to shareholders and employees. And so they want to talk about these ESG goals and their achievements. But there are considerable risks and consequences of making these disclosures. I think the first thing is you want to make sure that they're correct. If you are putting into documents that you're filing with the SEC, there's the possibility of enforcement actions for making inaccurate disclosures. There's also the possibility of private litigation. And when looking at what companies are disclosing, what we're seeing is them touting their ESG achievements. This is something that's definitive. We can say in 2020, we increased diversity of our workforce and our board of directors by X percentage. That's very clear and concise. What is more difficult to do is to say, hey, in 2022 or 2023, we're going to increase diversity by X, Y, or Z. And the issue is, if you miss those goals and you make these disclosures, that could cause some issues in the future. There's also the possibility of you making misleading disclosures, and that's something that is definitely going to want to be avoided. So before you make these disclosures, you want to take some time and stop, look, and listen, and make sure the legal team, the people who are producing this, whether it's HR or the environmental group, or somebody on the ESG committee is taking a look at this, and it is thoroughly vetted before you publish these disclosures. And things to be concerned about is the company guaranteeing certain goals in their public statements? This will certainly cause an issue if you miss those goals and could lead to some problems down the road. So what we're seeing are companies being a little bit more vague about what they're doing in their aspirations of what they're going to do in the future, but being definitive about their accomplishments. But when you do report those accomplishments, make sure that those are vetted thoroughly, and so that you're not providing and publishing inaccurate information. What standards is the company using for disclosing these metrics? And as we all know, there are a variety of standards. The ones I'm most familiar with are SASB, TCFD. I know there's also Bloomberg, GRI, and there's a couple other ones. And I think, the interesting thing about those different standards is they are used for different purposes. And so there's not one size fit all. And oftentimes a company will make 3 or 4 disclosures using the various standards, because one standard might be great globally or internationally, while another standard might be ideal for dealing with climate change. And is the company sufficiently tracking relevant information to report ESG metrics? Again, there's significant lead time to making these disclosures. And so you want to make sure that if you're going to be making disclosures in 2022, it's a great idea in 2021 to put in the legwork to make sure you get it right and make sure you have all the inputs that are necessary to make those disclosures. And then finally, are there sufficient disclosure controls in place to ensure timely reporting of ESG related information? If there are updates, be sure to provide these updates. And nobody wants to find out, months down the road that what they've been disclosing and reporting and holding out to be accurate is not in fact accurate. So in 2020, Haynes & Boone started working with an entity, Enercom, to try to take stock of the onshore oil and gas industry to figure out what's going on with ESG here. And we knew that a lot of the super majors were making massive steps and statements about ESG. So again, dealing with Exxon and Shell that are making these ESG disclosures, and they're saying in 2019 that we're going to be carbon neutral by or net zero by 2050. That shook the industry. And the question was, well, are the smaller companies going to be following suit? What are they doing? What are they disclosing? And where are they disclosing it? So what we decided to do is put together an oil and gas ESG tracker. What we looked at 30 onshore oil and gas companies with market caps between 100 million and $1 billion. And we want to see, what are the companies tracking? Where is this information reported? Is it going to be in their websites? Are there SEC filings? And at that time, we didn't really know which standards were being used, was there any particular standard that was preferred? Is there any sort of apples to apples comparison that can be made across the oil and gas industry? And alternatively, could it also be made a comparison against other industries? And so what we found are some general trends was that when we first started looking, we published our first report in March of 2021, is that ESG had been widely adopted. So out of the 30 companies, 70% had publicly disclosed their ESG policies. This was surprising to a lot of these companies had already embraced them. When we issued a second report in, I think, August or September, I think August of 2021, we found that number had grown from 70% to 83%. So 25 of the 30 companies had publicly disclosed ESG policies. And I expect the next time we look at that, the number in issue report, it's going to be somewhere around 27, 28 companies. And there's no doubt in my mind by 2022, most, if not all, companies will have ESG policies in the oil and gas industry. And again, these are public companies and these are not private companies. And we found that most are tracking their emissions and water usage reductions, but they're also increasingly focused on governance and social aspects. And we're finding that these ESG principles are embedded within company culture. So most of these companies have implemented comprehensive ESG programs. They're disclosing their greenhouse gas emissions. Net zero was something that's pretty fascinating. In March of 2021, we only had 2 of the 30 companies that had publicly disclosed a goal of net zero. And interesting, this was by 2025. And then when we looked again in August, by August, 5 companies had made these commitments to be net zero by 2025. So pretty explosive growth there. And I expect this growth to continue. And, probably there's going to be 10 or 15 companies by the end of 2022 of these 30 companies that have made these commitments to be net zero. And something discussed earlier, companies are reporting more ESG achievements, announcing more goals for each ESG criterion. So when they're publicly disclosing what they're doing on the ESG front, they are making more announcements about their achievements rather than their goals. And we're seeing a lot of information in proxy statements. So companies are increasingly addressing ESG goals and strategies in the proxy statement. They're disclosing more quantitative metrics. This is something that's being demanded by investors. They're showing their progress towards implementing these ESG goals. Companies are also talking about how they're dealing with stockholder issues, whether it's activist investors or just in letters to shareholders saying, hey, here's what you requested of us in 2020, and here's what we're doing in 2021. More companies are forming ESG committees and identifying directors with ESG related skills. And companies are also incorporating ESG metrics into their performance targets. So this is, again, something tied to, for example, executive compensation. Here's a view of the sample producers and what we saw. So in blue, the bar is what was disclosed in March of 2021. And in the orange, it's August of 2021 as well. So again, most are disclosing environmental goals and environmental achievements. And we're seeing in each one of these categories, you can see that there's more achievements that are being disclosed than their actual goals. So it's not surprising that in the energy industry, there's a lot of focus on the environmental aspect of ESG. And so companies are making greenhouse gas emissions disclosures, water usage disclosures, and also making commitments to say, hey, in 2025, we are going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by X percentage, or we're going to use more recycled water. In social, there's been a considerable growth in disclosures about social achievements. We're seeing a lot of companies that are disclosing what they're doing in communities and how they're engaging with local communities. But the thing that most companies are focused on is health, the health and safety of their employees, and they're making disclosures of that nature. In the energy industry, I know that's something that many companies are proud of, their safety records, and so they're making those disclosures as well. On the governance aspect, we're not surprised to see fewer goals as far as governance. They're not making commitments as to who is going to be a board of director, but they are touting the diversity of their board of director. And when we think of diversity, it can be in the form of racial or ethnic or religious diversity, gender diversity, but we can also see things such as age or experience diversity in companies that may not have diverse boards in the sense of racial or ethnic or religious diversity. Might be able to say, well, we don't have that, but at this time we do have considerable experience diversity or age diversity or gender diversity. And so it's going to it's going to vary based on company and what your company is focused on. So in proxy statement disclosures, we've seen considerable growth in these disclosures and in ESG being disclosed in SEC filings generally. And that grew considerably from 2021 to this year. Companies have begun including ESG disclosures in earning releases, major announcements, and other press releases. And so if you look at a lot of Q4 reports or Q3 end of quarter reports, you're going to see in these presentations discussion about ESG. The expansion of ESG disclosures is evidence that investors and other stakeholders continue to push for more disclosures. So companies are feeling this within companies, dealing with their peers, dealing with investors, and it's just what is demanded in the marketplace at this point. However, companies must balance the demand for disclosure with the potential liability, and this is something that many companies need to be incredibly concerned about and make sure that any of these disclosures are thoroughly vetted. Given the formation of the Climate Change Task Force and SEC commentary in 2021, we expect to see SEC enforcement activity related to ESG disclosures, and this is going to be tied to the forthcoming rules and more attention that's going to be focused, whether it is in SEC filings or other disclosures that are made by companies. And finally, companies should focus carefully on the process of tracking, vetting, and reporting ESG disclosures to mitigate any potential liability. So here's an example of something that we pulled from our tracker, where you can see as far as what companies are disclosing the governance aspect. And 14 sample producers of the 30 that we looked at disclosed a total of 31 governance quantitative metrics. The most common metrics disclosed were related to board diversity and board tenure. And it's going to change by company and what they're most proud about and what they really want to focus on. On the social aspect of ESG, from the proxy statements, when we reviewed them, they seems to be the most disclosures had to deal with worker safety. This is something that is easily quantifiable. So they have very thorough records here. Most companies have good safety records, and they want to be proud of that and tout that as far as ESG. They also disclose diversity in the workforce, community involvement, and things of that nature. But it is unsurprising that worker safety is the thing that is most disclosed. In 2021, we saw a lot. In 2020 and 2021, we saw a lot of activity in capital markets dealing with ESG. And there was a lot of media exposure and media attention on ESG funds. There was a rush to green funds in 2020. We saw considerable growth in renewable energy companies and anything electric vehicles, alternative fuels, things of that nature. And there's a lot of money that flowed into companies that were focused on alternative energy or any other aspect of ESG. We also saw a lot of, companies that had better in the oil and gas space. Enercom, when they did their analysis, they found more capital flowing to companies that had made ESG commitments and disclosures than to the bottom quartile of the 30 companies that we reviewed. So that bottom quartile had significantly less inflow capital than the companies that made the greatest disclosures. And so we found that pretty interesting. But if you look at this chart here, you see the pretty parabolic growth of ESG lending in global green bonds. And there's a number of terms that are used here. So social bonds, green bonds, sustainable bonds, ESG loans, green loans, things of that nature. And so, there can be a variety of these loans that are given, and some are given specifically for ESG focus. So there might be bonds that are issued solely to deal with a project that is going to reduce carbon emissions or something like that. But there's also a lot of lending that's going on, or a lot of attention in capital markets to ESG. And I know there's a number of private equity groups that are focusing on ESG, and large banks like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, BlackRock are also making ESG a focus, and they've been hyper-focused on ESG lending. And so they are looking at ESG and saying, are we going to make investments into capital-intensive industries such as oil and gas or mining or things of that nature? Because what we're seeing is a lot of companies that are now, or a lot of banks and lenders that are now, they are quantifying or looking at their impact on ESG. And so they say, we're giving these loans in the years past, we're giving these loans, we don't know what our carbon footprint is. And now there are groups that are coming together and saying, we want to be able to quantify our carbon footprint from the investments that we're making. So these green loans and sustainable loans have really grown over 2020 and 2021. So sustainability linked loans. So the LSTA came out with some guidance here. So if many of you will have dealt with credit facilities, and that those are something that are incredibly important for many companies. And what we're starting to see now, not necessarily with public companies, but we're seeing with private lenders dealing with private companies, we're starting to see certain key performance indicators, KPIs, pegged to interest rates in the loans. And so to oversimplify this, you're saying, if we're going to lend you money, and let's say it's going to be at X percentage rate, well, we're going to tie it to certain indicators and certain goals. And so if you are focused on water reduction, we might tie your loan to your future reduction in water. And so if you might receive a reduction of maybe 50 basis points if you meet a certain threshold. So what we're starting to see is a selection of key performance indicators. So evaluating the borrower's sustainability goals and the progress that they're making on those goals, and how transparent the current objectives and progress are of those. There's a disclosure of internal standards and certification of targets. So the banks are saying, where are we going to look at this company? What are we going to look at to see what they're doing to improve their ESG goals over a period of time? There's a negotiation of sustainability performance targets. So consideration of factors most impacting borrowers' business and operations. It's going to change company by company, and they want it to be meaningful. And so if you are a producer and you have emissions of, let's say, X, they want to see a reduction by a percentage Y, so that in 5 years or 2 years or whenever they go back and they reevaluate, you can say, hey, yes, you've met that reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, you're therefore going to be able to get a lower interest rate on your loan. So as part of these credit facilities that we're starting to see, and again, this is something that's going to be coming down the pike, the borrowers are going to be continually making disclosures to the lender to report the progress that they're making. And this is necessary because the lender needs to be able to track progress and verify any sort of data that is provided to justify that. So examples here. So for key performance indicators, so examples would be the percentage reduction in overall greenhouse gas emissions in operations, reductions in emissions in targeted part of operations, number of percentage of female minority board members or executives, minimum standards on recruiting processes, percent increase in services offered to underserved communities, things of that nature. If you're looking at green loans, renewable energy projects and making investments in that, and how community focused you are. And so this is something that, in my opinion, is nascent, but when I'm dealing with these credit facilities and talking to these banks and these lenders, one of the questions that I often get is, well, what are you seeing in the market? And at this point in the market, we're not seeing, I guess, many lenders that are making these sort of commitments, but we are seeing, groups like BlackRock that I think in 2019 or 2020, they had a large credit facility and they made it very clear. I think there was $400 million of that credit facility was tied to diversity goals in both the board of directors and in their workforce. And so I think in 2022 and 2023, as ESG becomes more accepted and more lenders are willing to take these chances and tie these credit agreements to certain ESG goals, we're going to see it become more commonplace increasingly. So with that, I think we'll leave about 15 minutes for some questions. I don't know if I have anything else. I think that's it.
Well, Chris, I've got a couple questions that have been asked. Let's see, we get a question number 4 here. We better answer the poll. We talk about, first of all, you talk about banks imposing key performance indicators on their customers. Well, what size banks and what size customers? I mean, how deep does it go?
Yes, that's a good question, Mike. We're not seeing the bigger banks, the ones that we commonly deal with. We're not seeing them, make these sort of requirements in their credit facilities. And so where we're seeing it is some of the smaller lenders, whether it's private lenders or smaller groups that are starting to kind of experiment with this. And I think a lot of larger groups have joined this entity. I've written down the name, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. And so this is a group, I think there's $23 trillion under management there. There's more than 100 groups, 100 financial institutions that are part of that. And they've outlined steps to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And they're attempting to standardize greenhouse gas accounting for greenhouse gas emissions financed by their loans and investments. And so it's a good question about whether, this is only the BlackRocks of the world or your local community bank that are focused on ESG. And I think it varies based on banks. I think it's going to be, when we saw commodity prices in the beginning of the year and then at 2020 significantly reduced, there were a lot of lenders that turned away from the energy industry, or at least the oil and gas industry. And so it became some of the smaller regional banks that were the ones that were making investments into energy groups. But, there's basically, it runs the gamut of large and small lenders, banks, in public and private companies.
Well, that'd be one question I'd be interested to ask Larry Sears offline. about what WAFED is looking at on that score. Well, and you talk about the metrics, and you mentioned a certifying agency. Will there be a development of a whole new consulting group for environmental metrics, social metrics, governance metrics, so that you get these certified or audited in some way?
That is a good question. I don't necessarily know the answer to that. I do know that there has been, I think in 2021, Larry Fink came out and said he recommends using both SASB and TCFD for making these disclosures. I think in 2018, 2019, and 2020, it was essentially no man's land. You had so many different groups that were making these disclosures, and it was very difficult to figure out, okay, which metrics should we be using to make these disclosures, and why are we using this, and why should we be using something else? And if you are an investor and you look at, Mike Cooper company, and you're using, A, B, and C, but Bruce Newsom is using metrics D, E, and F, it is difficult if I'm an investor to make a decision here. So there has been, at least in the companies that I've been looking at, there's been a considerable consolidation, and there's been a lot of focus on both SASB and TCFD. I know that there's some other groups that do these that might be useful for others on this call. If you have, for example, the Carbon Disclosure Project is big in the United Kingdom, the Global Reporting Initiative, but it's really going to depend upon, I guess, what you're disclosing, why you're disclosing it. And I think ultimately there's going to be multiple metrics that are used based on the disclosures, and whether you're focused on environmental aspects or global aspects and things of that nature. But there's no doubt, Mike, that this is a blossoming industry dealing with ESG metrics and disclosures. And this is definitely going to be an area that is going to grow considerably over the coming years.
Well, and you mentioned Larry Fink and BlackRock. I find it interesting. I'll throw this observation out to you. Back in 2019, when he first made the statement about BlackRock moving away from fossil fuels and looking for sustainability, what his most recent fund that closed, I think, over $1 billion, and they've invested in ExxonMobil, they've invested in ConocoPhillips, they've invested in Devon. I mean, this is their energy transition fund, and they're heavily invested in fossil fuels. How do we reconcile that approach?
Good question. And I think that is, both Shell, Exxon, Conoco, all of those groups have all made it very clear what their ESG goals are. And I know a number of those companies are making considerable investments in renewables. But what I would be surprised to see is if BlackRock made an investment in a public company that does not have an ESG policy. And so, and this goes back to the oil and gas ESG tracker in our work with Enercom, when they looked at where the money was flowing in the oil and gas space, they found that the number of groups, the highest quartile of disclosures, those were included in the most number of ESG funds. And there is significant reduction in the bottom quartile from those funds. And so we're seeing money, it's almost a big carrot there. It incentivizes companies to make these disclosures. And if you are, a carbon intensive industry and you do not have an ESG policy and are not focused on this, then you're missing out on opportunities, because large institutional investors are putting their money into groups that, even if they are traditionally in an extractive industry or carbon intensive industry, if you are making efforts and making steps towards ESG, whether it is carbon reduction or diversity or other aspects, then you're more likely to receive investments and be included in these funds than if you are not.
Do you, at this point, do you see any move for companies to address something as granular as scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions, which those terms have been around for a while with the EPA, but we can now see them. I think when you see them being incorporated into these ESG metrics, do you see a movement there?
Yeah, absolutely. And so when reviewing these companies and what they're disclosing, there is, considerable, most of these companies that are making disclosures are disclosing scope 1, scope 2, and to a lesser degree, scope 3. And, we're seeing these companies that are saying we're going to commit to being net zero by either 2050 or 2025, both direct and indirect emissions. And so what was originally focused on, hey, we're only going to be focused on what we're doing and where we can control this. Other companies are taking a step further and saying, well, we want to be focused on where our, if we're producing oil and gas, we're, putting it off on trucks and driving it. And that's considerable carbon footprint. So how do we reduce that? And so there's been hyper intensive focus here on scope 1, scope 2 in particular. And in all of that data is being included in either the SASB or the TCFD or other forms of disclosures.
I've got one last question here. Who should be involved in drafting these ESG disclosures?
That is something that I guess it needs to be comprehensive. And so with many companies, you might have one person who's the ESG chair, ESG director, who's going to be focused on that. And it might be a CFO, a lawyer, or somebody else who has that position. And it's basically going to be something that needs to be comprehensive. So because ESG, again, I think of it as a three-legged stool. So because it includes environmental, social, and governance aspects, you want to make sure that you include the HR department. You want to make sure that you include somebody from finance and somebody from environmental who's in the field who can verify this data. Make sure your regulatory people have seen it. And so if you have people who are dealing with local communities, you want to make sure that they have input, as well as the lawyers and VP of finance. And basically it just needs to be thoroughly vetted and it needs to be comprehensive. And so just making sure it's not one or two people in a company that is producing this, because the more people who are involved means the more verification and the greater the reduction in risk of incorrect disclosures.
Great. I don't have any other questions. Does anyone else have any questions for Chris? I see none popping up. If so, Chris, we very much appreciate your discussing this topic with us this evening. And I agree. I think it'll be one that will continue to become more and more acquainted with as time goes on.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Well, if we have no more questions, just want to thank Chris again for speaking today and Michael for moderating. And just to let everybody know, the next Energy Special Interest Group event will be on February 10th. Our steering committee and sponsors are working hard to pick a topic and all of that good stuff for the event. So stay tuned and we'll get those invitations out soon. Thank you guys so much and hope everybody has a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.